I had not heard his voice in 7 years. 7 years of convincing myself that distance was the same as healing, that enough time and enough geography could sand down the edges of something until it stopped drawing blood when you touched it. I had become fairly accomplished at that particular kind of self-deception. So when I pushed open the door of a small flower shop on a rain-soaked Tuesday afternoon in Seoul, I was not braced for anything. I was simply a woman looking for something to brighten a hotel room that smelled faintly of other people's lives. The bell above the door chimed, small and silver and unhurried. The man behind the wooden counter stilled, not the ordinary stillness of someone registering a customer entering. Something more interior than that, something that moved inward rather than outward. And then he tilted his head at a very specific angle, the angle of someone listening with everything they have. And then he smiled, slowly. The way you smile at something you thought you had permanently lost, finding its way back into your hands. And he said my name, softly, almost as though he was testing whether the words still fit in his mouth the way it used to. He said my name before I had offered a single syllable, before I had done anything except breathe in the green living scent of that flower-filled room, and stand in the doorway wondering which arrangement would look least lonely on a bedside table. And that was the precise moment I understood. The boy I had left behind in another chapter of my life, the one I had convinced myself had long since filed me under the category of things that no longer required his attention, had never stopped listening for the sound of me. Let me take you somewhere first. Not to the flower shop, not yet, to the version of Seoul that exists in my memory. The one that belongs to a 22-year-old who arrived from Lagos in the sharp-edged middle of February with 2 overpacked suitcases, a scholarship letter she had read so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds, and a specific quality of determination that she wore like armor because the alternative was admitting how genuinely frightened she was. Have you ever arrived somewhere completely foreign and felt the specific bewilderment of a person suddenly unable to read the most basic instructions of a world they are standing inside? That was me in Seoul for approximately the first 4 months. The language was a labyrinth I could not yet navigate. The social codes were intricate and layered and required fluency I had not yet earned. The winters were a physical renegotiation I was completely unprepared for, having grown up in a city where cold was a relative and mostly theoretical concept. I was lonely in the specific way of someone who is surrounded by millions of people and cannot reach any of them yet. My university classes were manageable, my coursework was manageable. But the hours between obligations, the hours that belong to living rather than performing the functions of living, those hours had a quality of echoing emptiness that I had not anticipated when I imagined this adventure from my bedroom in Lagos. I found the flower shop by accident, the particular kind of accident that retrospectively looks like inevitability. I had taken a wrong turning from the bus stop near my dormitory, which I was doing with regularity in those early months, and the rain had made decisive opinions about my original route irrelevant, and I ducked into the nearest doorway with a roof extending over it. The doorway belonged to a flower shop called Seoul, Winter. It struck me immediately that naming a flower shop Winter was either deeply melancholy or deeply optimistic, and I could not yet determine which. Inside it smelled of earth and green stems, and the specific sweetness of flowers gathered together in numbers sufficient to produce their own atmosphere. The narrow space was meticulously arranged, every surface considered. Nothing accidental. A young Korean man of perhaps 23 or 24 was reorganizing a low arrangement near the window. His movements careful and deliberate, in the way of someone who genuinely respects the materials he is working with. He did not immediately register my presence, because his back was to the door. I stood there dripping rainwater onto the wooden floor and feeling immediately guilty about it. Then he turned. Kang Min-jun had one of those faces that takes a moment to process fully, because everything in it is doing something. His eyes were the particular dark of polished wood. His expression when he saw me was open in the way that only genuinely curious people manage. The curiosity of someone who finds an unexpected thing and considers it an offering rather than an interruption. "You are very wet," he said, in Korean, and then, observing my expression with accuracy, repeated it in careful English. "You are very wet." "Yes," I said. "I apologize for the floor." He looked at the floor, then at me. Then he disappeared briefly and returned with a small towel that he held out at arm's length in a gesture that managed to be simultaneously practical and respectful of the specific awkwardness of offering a towel to a stranger. "For the rain," he said. "Thank you," I said. He nodded, returned to his flowers, left me to dry in peace, and that, precisely, was what made me come back. Not the flowers, not the shelter, not even the warmth of the interior after the biting February outdoor air, the being left to exist without performance, the absence of the particular social pressure that foreigners often feel in unfamiliar environments, the implicit requirement to justify their presence or explain their difference or be somehow instructive about where they originate from. He simply returned to his flowers, and I simply stood in the warmth, and neither of us required anything of the other. I returned the following Thursday, and the one after that. Our friendship assembled itself the way genuinely organic things assemble, without agenda, without the self-consciousness of people who have decided they want to become friends and are therefore performing the function of friendship for each other. I learned that he was a final-year university student studying environmental design, working afternoons and weekends at his family's flower shop because his father's health made the additional support necessary, and because, as he explained with a slight shrug that communicated no resentment whatsoever, he genuinely liked flowers. He learned that I was navigating a postgraduate program in sustainable architecture, that I missed the smell of rain on hot Lagos pavement in a way that no other precipitation on Earth had managed to replicate, and that I had a particular weakness for chrysanthemums because my grandmother had grown them in the narrow strip of garden behind her house, and their scent carried her specific presence in a way that was both comforting and devastating. He listened to this last piece of information with a quality of attention that I had not encountered frequently in 22 years of being listened to. Not the polite surface attention of someone waiting for their turn to speak. Something that went further in. "Which grandmother?" he asked. I looked at him. "The one on my mother's side," I said. He nodded, absorbed it, filed it in the specific interior location where he kept things that mattered. Later, without comment, he placed a small chrysanthemum in a thin-necked vase on the corner of the table where I had taken to sitting when I visited. Just one, simply there. He did not mention it. I did not mention it, but I thought about it for 3 days afterward. Have you ever had a friendship that felt like coming indoors? Not the grand arrival of something enormous and unavoidable, nothing that announced itself with appropriate fanfare. Just the specific, quiet relief of being somewhere that recognized you. That was what those months at Seoul became. Between my afternoon visits, we exchanged messages, the careful bilingual back and forth of two people, each practicing the other's language with more dedication than either of them admitted. We went for coffee in the narrow street behind the shop on the occasions when his schedule permitted. We walked through the botanical garden near the university when the cherry blossoms arrived and transformed the ordinary city into something briefly extraordinary. He showed me the logic of flowers, not the symbolic grammar of them, not what white chrysanthemums signify at a Korean funeral, or what red roses communicate in the specific romance vocabulary of every culture that has ever noticed them, but the actual internal logic, the structural intelligence of how a flower organizes itself, the engineering of a petal, the purpose of a thorn. I showed him photographs of Lagos, of the specific quality of late afternoon light along the third mainland bridge when the sea below turns copper, of the market near my childhood home where the fabric sellers arrange their wares in such extravagant color combinations that looking at them felt like a full sensory event. He studied these photographs with the same quality of attention he gave everything. "It looks like somewhere that requires your full presence," he said once. I looked at him. "Korea also requires my full presence," I said. "Different requirements." He smiled, and something in that smile made me look away first. I understood I was falling in love with him the way you understand a tide has shifted. Not in the moment of the shift, in retrospect, when you observe that your position relative to a fixed point has changed considerably and you cannot identify the precise moment it happened. I noticed it one evening in November. We were in the back room of the shop, the workroom where the arranging happened, where the stems were cut at their specific angles, and the conditioning water stood in tall plastic containers, and the scent was so concentrated it was almost a physical thing you moved through rather than merely breathed. He was teaching me to arrange a small bouquet, standing very close because the instruction required demonstration. His hands briefly over mine to correct the angle of my wrist, the warmth of the proximity, the particular focused quietness of his expression. And I thought, with the specific clarity of something arriving fully formed, rather than building gradually, I am going to miss this when it ends. Not the flowers, not the shop, not Seoul even, though I would miss Seoul. Him. I was going to miss the specific, unrepeatable experience of being in the world beside this person. And the understanding that I was going to miss him was the understanding that I had already arrived somewhere I had not consciously intended to travel to. I said nothing, because I was 22 years old and afraid in the specific way of people who understand that naming a thing makes it real and that reality can shatter. And because the semester still had 4 months remaining, and 4 months felt like an expanse of time in which anything might be possible, and because he had never indicated in any explicit articulation that what he felt had graduated from the warmth of genuine friendship into anything with different coordinates, and because chrysanthemums were already in the vase without anyone saying a word about them, and I had decided that was enough, for the moment, for now. The call came on a Wednesday night in February, my second February in Seoul, the anniversary almost precisely of the wet afternoon I had pushed open the door of a flower shop and stood dripping on someone else's wooden floor. My mother's voice on the phone carried a quality I had never heard in it before. Something that had been compressed into very small dimensions so she could manage to form words around it. My father had been admitted to hospital. The situation was serious in the specific way that medical personnel use that word when they mean something considerably more alarming than the word's ordinary usage suggests. I need you to understand the particular texture of those hours, the specific way that emergency compresses time and simultaneously stretches it, the way your hands work independently of your mind, packing things, booking things, making calls, while your mind occupies a separate internal space that is not yet coherent. I tried to reach Min Jun 4 times that night. His phone went to voicemail, which I later understood was because he was doing a late delivery, something he did occasionally when orders required it, and the signal in certain parts of the city was patchy. I left a message. It poured out in a combination of Korean and English that probably required charitable interpretation. I am leaving. Family emergency. My father. I will explain everything properly when I can. I will contact you properly. I believed this when I said it. I believed the properly was imminent. I arrived in Lagos to a situation that had already metastasized beyond the initial report. My father's condition was more critical than the first phone call had communicated, because my mother had been managing her own terror while she spoke to me, and had unconsciously calibrated the information downward to something she could bear to transmit. The weeks that followed were the kind that collapse into a blur of clinical lighting and corridor chairs, and the specific interminable waiting of families in hospitals who have surrendered their ordinary lives to the particular mercy of outcomes they cannot control. I did not contact Min Jun during those weeks, not because I had forgotten, because the cognitive and emotional bandwidth required for everything happening in that hospital left virtually nothing in reserve for managing the complexity of a conversation I could not yet navigate cleanly. I told myself I would contact him when my father stabilized, when I had a sentence or two of coherent space to formulate something worthy of the situation. My father stabilized, and then destabilized, and then stabilized again, more permanently, but with a recovery trajectory that required months, and a reorganization of family life that kept me in Lagos far longer than I had initially calculated. Meanwhile, the months accumulated. And with the months came a specific accumulating weight, not of absence exactly, of postponement becoming its own kind of presence. Every week that I did not contact Min Jun, the task of contacting him became architecturally more complex. The explanation required was larger. The gap to be bridged was wider. The vulnerability of arriving after so long a silence with the honest account of why became more exposed and more terrifying. I told myself he would have moved on. I told myself this with the specific insistence of someone who is saying the thing they most fear is true, as a form of preemptive protection. He will have moved on. He is 24. He is in Seoul. He will have found someone who was actually present, someone who did not vanish without adequate accounting. I told myself this until I believed it enough to use it as the reason I did not write. What happened to him during those same years is something I learned only later. He waited. For a month he waited for a returned call, or a completed message or some form of continuation from the garbled voicemail I had left. When nothing came, he attempted to reach me through the university contact information he possessed, which was outdated by then. He went through mutual acquaintances, the small loose network of international students and Korean friends we had both been tangentially connected to. Most of them had also departed after the academic year. He wrote a letter to an address he had for me in Lagos that I had given him once in the context of a conversation about whether physical letters still held any genuine communicative value in a digital era. He had been in favor of their value. He had written to test his position. The letter arrived during the period when my family had temporarily relocated to be nearer to my father's specialist, and nobody collected it in time, and it was eventually returned. He did not know this. He only knew the silence. And then, approximately 8 months after I disappeared from his life, an accident. The details are not mine to render dramatically. They belong to him and to the period of adjustment that followed them. What I know is that a vehicle collision on a rain-slicked road outside Seoul left him with damage to the optic nerve that the specialists, after exhaustive investigation, determined was permanent. He lost his sight. The world he had navigated by the specific intelligence of his eyes, the intelligence that assessed the logic of a flower structure and catalogued the copper quality of a Lagos sunset in a photograph, and noticed the angle of a wrist holding a stem. That world became a different one. He learned it. I say this not to minimize what the learning required, but because it is the accurate statement. He learned the new coordinates of his world with the same deliberate, unhurried attention he had always given to whatever he was engaged with. He expanded the flower shop, he developed systems, he hired assistants for the components of the work that required visual acuity he no longer possessed, and he continued. Because the shop was his father's, and then his, and because flowers do not require you to see them to understand them, and because continuing was the available option, and he has always been, at his core, someone who works with what is actually in front of him. But in the 7 years between my disappearance and the rainy Tuesday, when a silver bell chimed above a flower shop door, nobody had said my name in his world. Not because they had instructions not to, because he did not speak of me to people who had not known me. Because some things are kept in the interior places rather than offered to the general atmosphere. Because the sound of a name you are waiting to hear is diminished by saying it yourself. I stood in the doorway of the flower shop for what felt like a geological unit of time. Actually, it was perhaps 4 seconds. 4 seconds during which the man behind the counter who had spoken my name before I offered him any syllable of my own was standing very still with an expression I had no immediate framework for interpreting. He looked the way a person looks when something they had almost persuaded themselves was definitively in the past reveals itself to be present tense. His hair was shorter than I remembered. There were years in his face that had not been there before, the specific kind that arrival has to do with experience rather than mere chronology. He was wearing a dark green apron over a cream-colored knit sweater. His hands rested on the counter surface. His eyes were open, but they were looking at a point slightly past my left shoulder rather than at me. This is when I registered. This is when the understanding arrived that rearranged everything simultaneously. Minjun, I said, the only word I had available. Yes, he said, and there was something in that single syllable that was not an answer to my saying his name, but a confirmation of everything he had heard in my saying it. The specific acoustics of me, the phrasing of my voice. 7 years of absence, and he had still maintained the interior record well enough to identify it from one word spoken in a flower-scented room. "How did you—" I started. "Your breathing," he said simply. "The pause before you speak, and then the way you said hello, even though you changed it to a single syllable of my name instead." He paused. Some things do not revise themselves with time. I had prepared, in the abstract way of someone who imagined this encounter was theoretically possible, but had not genuinely anticipated its arrival, several versions of what I might say if I ever found myself before him again. None of them were accessible. I stood in a Seoul flower shop on a rain-soaked Tuesday, with 7 years of undelivered explanation between us, and could not locate a single coherent sentence. I said. "Come in," he said. "You are letting the cold in." This was so exactly the calibrated practicality of the person I remembered that it produced in me an involuntary sound that was somewhere between a laugh and the thing that precedes tears, and was entirely neither. I came in. I let the door close behind me. The bell chimed again, softly as it settled. We talked for 3 hours that first afternoon. Not the conversation that needed to happen. Not the explanation and the accounting and the honest reckoning with 7 years of silence. That conversation required more careful assembly than 3 hours in a flower shop, while rain continued its opinions about the city outside permitted. But the preliminary conversation, the one that establishes whether two people who were once something to each other can occupy the same room after significant time without the room becoming unbearable. We could. He made tea, moving through the back room of the shop with the specific navigational confidence of someone who knows every coordinate of their environment precisely enough that the absence of one sensory input is a subtraction the others compensate for. I watched him and felt, layered beneath everything else, the particular quality of witnessing someone you care about demonstrate their own resilience in a way that makes you understand them differently than you did before. He asked about my work. I told him about the architectural consultancy I had joined in Accra, the projects that had brought me back to Seoul on assignment, the specific pleasure of designing spaces that served the people occupying them rather than performing grandeur for no one in particular. I asked about the shop. He told me about its expansion over the years, the additional space he had incorporated after his father retired, the delivery service he had built, the arrangement workshops he offered on Saturday mornings that had accumulated a small devoted following. "People come to learn flowers," he said, "and then they stay because arranging things is unexpectedly clarifying." "Clarifying," I said. "When everything around you is disordered, putting stems in water at the right angle for the right reason turns out to be a form of therapy nobody officially prescribed." I looked at him. "Did you prescribe it for yourself?" I said. A brief pause. "Extensively," he said. The true conversation happened 3 days later, on a Friday evening after the shop had closed, and the last of the day's arrangements had been completed, and the back room held only the ambient scent of everything that had moved through it that week. I had returned each of those 3 days, not at his invitation exactly, at the invitation of an unspoken mutual understanding that the preliminary conversation had been completed and what came next required space and honesty, and neither of us fleeing the room before both of those things had been fully deployed. I told him everything. The call, the hospital, the weeks that became months, the specific architecture of shame and postponement that had eventually calcified into the kind of silence that generates its own momentum and becomes increasingly difficult to interrupt. I told him about the letter I later discovered had been returned undelivered. I told him that I had been afraid, once sufficient time had elapsed, that arriving after so long with an explanation would be experienced as worse than the silence, that the gap had become so wide I could not see across it. He was quiet for a long time after I finished, not the silence of someone marshalling a response, the silence of someone genuinely absorbing what they have been given. I thought, he said finally, that I had misread everything. I looked at him. The chrysanthemums, I said. Something moved across his face. The chrysanthemums, he confirmed. You never said anything, I said. Not directly. Neither did you, he said. And this was so precisely accurate that I had no argument to offer it. I was afraid, I said, of naming it and having the name change what it was. He was quiet for a moment. I was waiting for you to name it first, he said, because I thought if I named it and I was wrong, it would alter something I needed to remain as it was. We sat with the specific absurdity and tenderness of two people, discovering that they had both been waiting for the other to speak first, for years, across an ocean, across a silence that had calcified between them, without either of them understanding that the other was also waiting. I am sorry, I said, for the voicemail that was not enough, for the silence that followed. For every week I told myself you had moved on without asking you whether that was actually true. He tilted his head at the specific angle I now understood as his listening posture. I am sorry, he said, that I stopped writing after the letter was returned. I told myself the returned letter meant something it may not have meant. It meant the address was wrong, I said. Yes, he said, which is considerably less conclusive than I permitted it to become. I extended my sole assignment by 2 weeks. This required a professional conversation that I had not entirely planned, but that my project director, a pragmatic woman who had seen enough to understand that personal circumstances occasionally require accommodation, received with relative grace. The 2 weeks became a month. The month became an open-ended arrangement that surprised everyone, including me. I began spending mornings at the flower shop before my afternoon work obligations, not performing any particular function at first, simply occupying the space while Min Jun went about the ordered choreography of his day, receiving deliveries, conditioning stems, answering calls with the specific warmth he offered everyone, regardless of the scale of what they were purchasing or the coherence of what they were requesting. Gradually, I made myself useful. He taught me to identify flowers by their texture and their scent, rather than their visual signature. He placed a stem in my hands and told me to describe it without looking, and then corrected my description, not by telling me I was wrong, but by offering additional detail that refined my perception. The edge of that petal, he said once, guiding my fingertips, has a quality that is different from the center. Do you feel that? I did. Most people look at a flower and stop, he said, because sight gives you so much information so quickly that you think you have the complete picture. You have a very efficient picture. You do not necessarily have the complete one. I looked at him. Is that, I said carefully, a broader observation? The corner of his mouth moved. It might be, he said, depending on how broadly you choose to receive it. We rebuilt what we had, not as a replica of the original, but as something related to it the way a translation is related to its source text, carrying the essential meaning, rendered differently because the languages available had shifted. He had a particular laugh I had forgotten, not a large laugh, something quieter than that, emerging when something struck him as precisely rather than broadly funny, a laugh that acknowledged the specific quality of a specific observation. Hearing it again the first time produced in me a physical sensation I can only describe as recognition so complete it was almost painful. He laughed at something I said on a Thursday afternoon, and I stopped speaking mid-sentence. "What?" he said. "I forgot," I said. "That sound. I forgot it specifically." He was quiet. "Which sound?" he said. "That one," I said. "The one you just made." A pause. "I forgot the sound of you forgetting things mid-sentence," he said, "and then noticing what you forgot and wanting to address the noticing rather than completing the original sentence." I stared at him. "That is extraordinarily specific," I said. "I had 7 years to catalogue specifics," he said. "There were a substantial number of them." One evening in the 3rd week, sitting in the workroom after the shop had closed, he said something I had not anticipated. "I want to tell you something about the blindness," he said. "Not the medical account of it, the interior one." I set down what I had been holding. "Tell me," I said. "At the beginning," he said, "the most disorienting aspect was not the darkness. It was the realization that everything I had navigated by, every assumption I had made about how I moved through the world, required complete reassessment." He paused. "I had to rebuild my map of everything from different information." He turned his head slightly in my direction. "The reassessment was devastating, and then it became something else. It became clarifying in the way that the most difficult things sometimes are, after sufficient time. Because when you cannot rely on the most dominant sense, you become uncommonly receptive to everything else." I waited. "I hear things," he said, "in the way I did not hear them before. I understand the temperature of a room from its acoustics. I understand a person's mood from the rhythm of their footsteps before they speak. I understand more about the flowers I work with than I understood when I could see them." He was quiet for a moment. "I understood your voice," he said. "From a single breath and a pause and one word. 7 years. And I understood it immediately. That is not something I could have done before." I sat with the weight of that. "Is that," I said, "your way of telling me that something good emerged from something terrible?" "No," he said. "It is my way of telling you that the terrible thing did not end everything, which is different." I looked at him. "That is an important distinction," I said. "I have had considerable time to refine it," he said. The exhibition was his idea. I discovered this only later. At the time, he presented it as a professional opportunity, a quarterly showcase that the shop participated in through a cooperative of small independent Seoul florists, an event at which each participating shop contributed an installation. He asked if I would help him conceptualize and execute his contribution. I said yes without sufficient interrogation of what I was agreeing to. I understood more clearly what I had agreed to when, over the following week, he described to me the architecture of what he wanted to build. 7 arrangements, each one corresponding to a specific period or element of a story. A first encounter, represented by a single white chrysanthemum in a thin-necked glass vase on a wooden surface with a small folded towel beside it. An evolving friendship, represented by an abundant mixed arrangement in the specific colors of a Lagos afternoon he had once studied in a photograph. A February departure, represented by an incomplete arrangement, stems gathered but not placed, the assembling interrupted. A long silence, represented by a single dried arrangement in a sealed glass vessel, preserved but not living. A rainy afternoon return, represented by a lush green arrangement in deep jewel tones, everything thriving. A rebuilding, represented by two complementary arrangements, placed separately but oriented toward each other, each complete independently and also in clear relationship. And a seventh arrangement, which he did not describe to me. "I will tell you about the seventh at the exhibition," he said. I looked at him. "That is cryptic," I said. "It is intentional," he said. The exhibition took place on a Saturday evening in a gallery space in Mapo that smelled of wooden floors and the specific concentrated floral atmosphere of 7 florists having installed their work within the same afternoon. Minjun's installation occupied a corner space. The 6 described arrangements were positioned along 2 walls and on several low platforms, with small printed cards beside each one that offered the briefest possible description. Not the full account, fragments, enough to make the viewer feel they were glimpsing something intimate. People moved through the space with the particular hushed attention of people who understand they are in the presence of something that took longer to make than its surface suggests. I stood beside him as visitors came and went, and occasionally asked questions that he answered with economy and warmth. Toward the end of the evening, when the gallery had thinned to perhaps a dozen remaining visitors, he touched my elbow lightly. "The 7th arrangement," he said. He guided me to a position in front of a small pedestal I had noticed earlier, but been unable to examine, because something in his manner had suggested I should wait. "Describe it to me," he said. I looked at what was on the pedestal. A bouquet, small and contained, in a simple pale ceramic vessel. Chrysanthemums at the center, white and fully open. Around them, layered outward, flowers I recognized from our weeks of working together. Flowers I had learned by texture and scent rather than by sight. The arrangement was complete without being elaborate, every element earning its position. "There are chrysanthemums at the center," I said. "White, fully open, around them." I named each element as I identified it. And around the outside, at the very edges, something I don't know the name of. Small, very pale. They look like they are leaning inward toward the center rather than outward. "Forget-me-nots," he said. I was very still. "They do not typically arrange with chrysanthemums in this way," he said. "The size differential is unconventional, but the inclination of the outer flowers toward the center is something that happens naturally when they are placed in proximity. I cannot see it, but you can confirm it for me." "Yes," I said. "They are leaning toward the center." He nodded, and then he reached into the pocket of the dark coat he was wearing for the exhibition and took out a ring. He held it with the careful certainty of someone who has rehearsed this moment, not as performance, but as preparation. "I lost my sight years ago," he said. "I have rebuilt my entire comprehension of the world from different foundations, and I have learned that the most important things do not require eyes." A pause. "I heard you in a single breath across a flower shop. I knew you before you offered me your name, and I know, with the same certainty I use to navigate everything I cannot see, that I do not want to spend any further portion of my life without your voice in it. He extended the ring in my direction. Zuri, he said, will you stay? Not will you marry him, not framed as a grand proclamation. 2 words with the full weight of 7 years of absence and several months of rebuilding concentrated into them. Will you stay? I took the ring from his hand and placed it where it was intended and said yes, quietly, the way the most significant things are often said. The wedding was in the spring. We held it in a garden, not because we were making a statement about flowers, but because a garden in April in the part of Korea where his family had deep roots is genuinely one of the most beautiful places a person can stand, and we saw no reason to be philosophical about that. My family came from Lagos, his family came from different provinces. The 2 groups of people who had no previous connection to each other became, over the course of 2 days, connected by the specific temporary intimacy of people gathered for the same purpose. My mother cried before the ceremony had properly begun. His father, who was frail but present, and insisted on walking Minjun a portion of the way down the path before handing off to the groomsmen, held his son's hand for a moment and said something too quietly for me to catch. Minjun smiled, the smile that I knew, the one that had no performance in it. Sometimes love does not disappear. I know this now in the specific way you know things that have been proven to you by your own experience rather than theorized from the outside. Sometimes love is simply patient in a way that outlasts the patience of the people carrying it. Sometimes the thing you left unfinished in one season waits, without resentment, for the season in which you return to it. And sometimes a bell above a flower shop door chimes, and a man who has been listening for the specific acoustics of one person among the millions of people in a city tilts his head and says a name, and everything that calcified begins, very quietly, to soften. I think about that Tuesday afternoon sometimes. The rain, the wet pavement, the particular detour that brought me to a doorway with a roof. And I think about all the Tuesdays on which I might have taken a different route. And I am, each time I think about it, grateful beyond what language adequately conveys for the specific Tuesday I actually took. Have you ever lost someone not to death but to circumstance, to the accumulated weight of time and silence, and the specific shame of not knowing how to interrupt the silence once it had grown too large? Have you ever found your way back to something you had almost surrendered to the category of irretrievably lost? This story is about the extraordinary tenacity of certain connections, about the ones that do not revise themselves with time, about a man who listened for a voice across 7 years without deciding to stop, and a woman who finally understood that the detour that looked like a mistake was the most direct route available. Thank you for being here, for staying with this story through to the last arrangement. If this reached something genuine in you, subscribe, because there are more stories where this one came from. Stories about the second chances that arrive when you have stopped preparing for them, about the loves that bloom in the specific season they were always intended for, about the extraordinary, unremarkable miracle of 2 people finding their way back to each other across the distances that seemed, for a time, definitive. New stories as often. I will be here.